Talk of separating from Canada is growing among some circles in this province. The province plans to make it easier for referendum questions to make it onto a ballot, and a group pushing for a sovereign Alberta says its website has seen a huge uptick in curious people. This, of course, is not a new sentiment in the West, nor has it been in Quebec, which famously has held 2 referendums. For a look at how these movements might be similar and how they differ, Andrew McDougall is a researcher on this. He's an assistant professor in Canadian politics at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and has authored a book on Quebec's 1995 referendum and federalism. So take us back to the context. What was happening leading up to Quebec's 1995 referendum?
Yeah, it was a time of great constitutional turmoil in Canada. It's a period that we call the mega constitutional era in Canadian political science. That basically covered a period really from about 1960 to about 1998 or so. And that included a huge social transformation in Quebec that was known as the Quiet Revolution, where we really saw the emergence of Quebecois nationalism kind of coming to the forefront. And through that, a whole period of debate where Quebecers were trying to decide whether they were better in Canada or outside of it. And then through that, we saw the election of the first PQ government in 1976 that was promising a referendum on sovereignty association. That then actually happened in 1980. There was a promise to try to renegotiate the Constitution alongside other reasons for doing that, which led to the Charter in 1982, which led to Quebec being left outside of the Constitution politically, although not legally, because they decided not to sign it. And then 2 subsequent rounds of constitutional negotiation in the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords in an effort to get Quebec to sign on to it, both of which failed, which led directly into the 95 constitutional referendum, sovereignty referendum, which the sovereigntists nearly won in 1995, making the argument that there wasn't any more room for negotiation on any of these issues. Since then, the issue hasn't gone away, but it's died down a little bit. Most people point to the Quebec secession reference as being sort of a turning point on that sort of made it clear that Quebec could, leave, or at least there'd be a duty to negotiate in the event there was a clear question answered yes in a referendum. But it was heady times in 1995. There was a lot going on then.
So when you look over to Alberta now, I mean, I know you haven't poured your sort of research mind into this, but what do you see happening in Alberta that has similarities and differences from what was happening in Quebec at that time?
It's really interesting. I mean, one thing that I think is fascinating is the extent to which Alberta seems to be tracking in many ways some of the plays that Quebec did in earlier generations. An example of this, of course, would be the move towards possibly an independent Alberta pension plan. This was one of the earliest moves that Quebec nationalists did in the 1960s when the CPP was first being set up, and it exists today as the QPP, which interacts a lot with the CPP but is distinct. So that's kind of interesting. Some of the language that's used is also interesting. I believe over the weekend, Premier Smith referred to what she wanted was Alberta's provincial sovereignty in a united Canada, which of course has echoes of squaring the circle in Quebec, where what Quebecers say is an independent Quebec and united Canada. So it's interesting.
What do you think that means?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, in the Quebec case, it's all about defending, provincial jurisdiction and making sure that there's no overstep from the federal government. And it might mean something very similar here. Of course, some of the differences include the question about whether or not in Western Canada we have the same level of nationalism, separate nationalism that we have in Quebec, right? I mean, the Quiet Revolution was all about the emergence of the Quebecois nationalism. Well, we certainly have regional identities in Western Canada. Whether or not there's a national project to ground something like an independence movement, that's an open question. I think something that surveys and survey takers will be paying close attention to.
So you mentioned our Premier Danielle Smith. How do you reflect on the leadership around 1995 in Quebec, the various premiers and stay and go leaders, and what's happening, what you see in Alberta now?
Well, again, I mean, I think what Premier Smith is doing is echoing a lot of what she's seen happening in Quebec over the years. And it looks as though the takeaway here is that approach that Quebec has taken to the rest of the country has been successful in getting concessions out of the federal government. Now, whether or not that's going to succeed in this case, or what exactly it is Alberta wants, that's a separate question. I mean, although there may be lessons certainly from Quebec, whether or not the politics will translate identically is I think kind of an open question there. It's kind of like how sometimes people try to import American politics or political ideas into Canada. It doesn't always work so well, and I think something similar might be happening here, where you may try to translate what happened in Quebec into another context, but it's not clear that it's going to succeed.
There's resistance from a lot of Indigenous governments and organizations in the province saying, hey, it's not within Alberta, the province of Alberta's authority to make this call. How did that question and that play out during the sovereignty push in Quebec?
Yeah, it's another point of similarity. There was resistance in Quebec in 1995 to the idea that the referendum would automatically include Indigenous peoples. And there was some real pushback on that. Now, we never got to a point where there was a yes vote, so there wasn't a huge amount of clarity on what that meant. But in looking at that, it's a clear echo to some of the ambiguities that we saw in Quebec, and I think that question is a good one, and it's a live one in Alberta.
What was the experience of people? Like, what impact did it have on the province as people seriously weighed a sovereignty question?
Well, it was hugely divisive. There's no question about that. For a good 15 or 20 years, it sort of dominated the provincial political discussions, and you saw a real fracturing of the party system between the Federalists and the Sovereigntists, between the PQ and the Liberals. It sort of took up all the political oxygen. In fact, that's one of the reasons why François Legault is credited to have broken through that in 2018 when him and his CAQ got elected, was that he was promising to try to get past that it sort of occupied provincial politics for so long, it was no longer really productive. And so he was going to be the person to sort of put aside some of these questions and try to move on to other things without fully abandoning the possibility of pursuing a nationalist project.
Was there a significant flight, either of people that didn't want to live in a destabilized province, or people that didn't get their way and split?
Yeah, it's certainly been there's certainly been this view that the period when Quebec sovereignty was really coming in as a force, that it was economically damaging to Quebec. And a lot of people point to this as the moment when Montreal was superseded by Toronto as the financial center in Canada. So there was a lot around that. And of course, during the referendum periods, you could certainly see economic effects coming forward. For example, the dollar would drop whenever it looked as though the sovereignty project was making gains. But I think a lot of people in Quebec saw this as being more important in the sense that it was securing the cultural future of the Quebecois people. So even if it was a price, I think a lot of people thought that it was worth paying.
How is it seen now? Like the referendum failed, obviously. As you say, the notion of sovereignty hasn't completely gone away, but is this and now it's happening, something similar with its differences in Alberta. Is this just how it goes?
Well, all countries have these sorts of movements, and they kind of wax and wane. I don't think anybody would say that the Quebec sovereignty movement is gone. The PQ was leading in the polls not so long ago, and may very well be today. I'd have to go back and check what the latest polling is. And of course, the Bloc Québécois is still very much a force. And when you poll people in Quebec about whether or not they'd vote yes, there's a strong base of support, sort of between 30 or 40%, and that could translate, under the right conditions, into a yes vote. So it's still there. And of course, in Alberta, there's nothing new about regional alienation or Western alienation or Western separatism. That's also been around for decades. So who knows? Maybe this is a moment when it's transforming into something even bigger.